Hi, my name's Jo Walker. I work at Aberystwyth University, where I'm a research development officer. So I help academics bring in funding. So everything from finding funding opportunities, editing applications, helping with budgets and university paperwork, that sort of thing. My background is in computer science, where I have a PhD and a postdoc in robotics, and I now work in IBERS, which is a biology department. So that's my background. I'll hand over to Loredana.
Okay, so Loredana Polezzi, yes, I'm joining you from Long Island. I am here professor of Italian American and Italian studies. I've been in modern languages translation studies all my life, most of it in the UK. And I've been part of a couple of large grants, also in the UK, but international grants. And I also serve on a number of panels.
My name is Ysgrifennu, and I've got a chair in computer science at Aberystwyth University. I've got an interest in medical image analysis, in helping a radiologist understand and predict cancer development. I'm also head of the graduate school in Aberystwyth University and look after all postgrad students within the university. I've got a track record of grant applications and success there as well, from very small ones like travel grants to very big ones, like one of the most recent ones was funding for 55 PhD students, and that is actually very welcome, of course. Most universities actually have a substantive internal process before you do a submission, like people involved like Joe, who are research development officers, but also finance will actually sign things off, and your head of department might actually put a signature on a bit of paper as well to indicate that you're allowed to actually submit a proposal. Let's assume that all happened, and then you've got a submission. The submission will first be checked with most funding bodies by a desk officer who will actually make sure that you've actually followed the rules. And the rules can be actually really simple. Have this font size and this font type and these margins and that many pages, and people will actually check that. And if you actually don't actually follow those rules, then they might actually send it back to you, or it might actually be rejected at that point. So make sure that you actually follow the rules, because it's actually very silly to actually spend 6 months on writing a proposal and then get it back, noting that you haven't used the right font for it. Once that actually has happened, so the funding body is happy that you've actually followed the rules, it will actually be sent out for review. And most of the time, it will actually, a funding body will aim to actually get 3, 4, 5 reviews back. To actually achieve that, they might actually have to contact up to 20 reviewers, because most of those people are actually busy. They might actually be conflicted, etc., etc. So it actually goes out to a wide community, and then hopefully they'll actually get 4 or 5 responses back and saying, yes, I'll review that. I'll do that by the deadline, etc., etc. Reviewers actually have a sort of couple of weeks, months to actually provide comments, and they'll actually send those back to the funding body. And for quite a few funding bodies, they will actually ask the PI to actually respond to the reviewer's comments. That's an optional aspect. It doesn't always happen, but certainly with UKRI, which is one of the main funding bodies in the UK, that is the case. And so you can actually get early sight of the reviewer's comments, and you get 1 or 2 pages to actually respond to that. Most of the time, that's very time limited. Most of the time, you will only get 5 to 7 days or something like that to actually provide your response back to the funding body. Sometimes for some funding streams, especially for fellowships, there's the possibility of an interview as well. And all that information, so the submission, the review's comments, possible interview might be done at panel. The response that you actually have as a PI to the review's comments will all go to a panel. Towards the end of the session, we'll actually look at the details of a panel, and I won't actually say too much about that. The panel will effectively rank the proposals, and they will be looking at something in the region of 20 proposals on a day, and they'll actually threshold them as well. So they will actually say, this is the order that we actually think from best to worst, and we think that all above this threshold potentially could get funded or are good enough to be funded. And then if you're actually above that threshold, then the funding body will actually decide, yes, that's okay. We've actually got that amount of money and we'll fund the first N proposals. And they'll actually contact you as the PI and indicate, yes, you have funding or you don't have funding, which is sad, of course, but happens as well. And then don't be surprised if it's actually down to you to actually share the outcome as well and actually start the process of the grant. Some funding bodies will actually inform your university that you've been funded, some actually don't, in which case make sure that finance in your university and your relevant RDOs are actually aware of that. So that is whistle-stop tour of the submission process, things that can happen, will happen, etc., etc. Clearly, the amount of funding might actually make some of these things more involved. Some processes actually, some specific calls actually have an initial stage where they actually ask for an expression of interest, and they will actually do a sifting of that expression of interest, and that can happen as well. So there can be multiple stages in this process as well. Any questions about that? And you can put them either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and shout out a question.
While people put questions in, I think I can again add just a few additional comments to that, mostly with a sort of UKRI hat on, but as Ray was saying, different bodies will do different things. Some bodies will be more transparent, by the way, with their processes and also with their feedback. UKRI tends to be. Others are much less forward in telling you exactly what the process is or exactly who and what is involved, and also exactly why you were awarded or not awarded. I think one thing to note is that some schemes are specifically early career, for instance, and so there will be a process which is exactly like this, or one version of this, and it's specifically for early career. But often when applications arrive at the panel, it will be noted which ones are early career and which ones are not. So it may be a mixed process where they're in the same track. And it's not so much that they're considered preferentially, it's not so much that that there's a lower threshold of quality. That is definitely not the case, but the questions are asked in slightly different format, and the reviewers will be, well, the format is the same, but the reviewers will have been asked to note the fact that it's early career. And when it comes to the actual, after ranking, when it comes to the actual funding, the funding body, the UKRI Council, will take that into account. But they're not necessarily scored sort of more benevolently or required a less, it's not a question of the threshold of quality. I would want to stress that. And the other thing that I would stress, we'll talk about panels more later, but panels don't themselves, as Rhea just said, don't themselves decide who is funded and who isn't. They put a threshold again, and they say below this, we don't think they are worth funding, above we think they are. But then the actual distribution of money, often at panels, we don't even know the exact amount of money that is available for that call. And so we may not be able to determine exactly who is funded. We do, however, take decisions in panels about who should not be funded. So that is essential. And with interviews and panels, also, there may be non-academic members there. That's something to keep in mind. So in the sciences, especially, there may be people from industry there. In the social sciences, humanities, often it's people from, well, it depends on the call, but it could be, again, from industry, from the voluntary sector, NGOs, and so on. And they are important members of the group and of the panel. And the last thing I would want to note is that increasingly, in the context of deciding on funding, equality and diversity and the ethics of an application are absolutely fundamental. And that's one of the things that even if the reviewers had not picked up on that, an application could be scored down during the final phases of the assessment for not fulfilling these requirements.
Adding to that, so I sit on a panel which is basically on the medical side of the world or the healthcare side of the world, and that panel will actually have lay people on there as well, and the expectation is that you have co-created your proposal with end users, and that's an important part in that panel. That panel specifically as well would indicate at the beginning how much funding they will have available, and so that is taken into account throughout the process as well, and we'll set 2 different thresholds. I think I've actually answered. There's one comment that ECR status is actually different for different funding bodies, and yes, that is true. If we actually do things within our university, we tend to actually use a UKRI version of that ECR definition, and that actually does take career breaks, etc., into account, and that's an important part of that.
Yeah, and that again is linked to that. Also, it's very strongly linked to the equality and diversity dimension of the process.
There's a question as well about funding for postdocs, and so fellowships are available for postdocs effectively, because that's maybe the next step in your career. The other thing we mentioned last week as well was that you could actually do a proposal together with an established academic in a university and effectively apply for your own funding. I did so for my first grant. That wasn't successful, but I was effectively writing or asking for funding for the next 3 years of my career at that stage, and it was submitted not by myself but by my then supervisor. So you need to trust somebody as well, but it was written in collaboration with them, so I didn't have any problems with that whatsoever.
And that again, that sort of sends us back to something we were talking about last week, which is also different stages in your career. It may be that you have this phenomenal idea and you absolutely want to go for your own grant, but at the same time, going for collaborative grants, being part of a grant that is led by someone else, or a different institution, even if that's the strategic thing to do, may be very important. And there's also, I've seen a lot of questions about the internal process. One thing to remember, again, do pay attention to your own internal processes. There are some grants, for instance, for which universities will have internal selection processes. They will not put forward every single application that they might get for it. And that applies to fellowships as well. So for instance, things like, even, I don't know, European Marie Curie applications, an institution may say, we want to assess the candidature, and they will not put necessarily all of them forward. So make sure you are aware of the regulations and you speak to people internally. Don't assume that there are no barriers at all at the internal level. You might end up with some surprises, not all of them pleasant.
Yeah, speaking as research development officer, I'd always advise anyone, especially if you're it's one of your first grants, to speak to the equivalent of your research development officer, so somebody who works in your research office, who can guide you and will alert you to any internal competitions or additional internal rules that you need to follow ahead of submission. So looking a little bit about grant writing style. So when you write a journal paper, you sort of write in a logical fashion. You have a title, the background will then identify the gap in the literature or the gap in the research that you're aiming to fill, the aims and the methodology that you follow to fulfill those aims. When you're writing a grant application, it's really important that you hook your reader in right at the beginning. So you start with the aim. You don't bother with the background first. You put the aim of the research and why that's important right at the front. Then you follow in with the background, identifying where your research fits in, and then the method. So unlike a journal article where people in your field are going to be reading it, and they're reading it for their own benefit as much as anything else. They're reading it in order to understand their field and know the current state of the art to inform their own research. When you're writing a grant application, someone's reading it because it's part of your job as an academic. It's part of the greater good. So it's a slightly different thing. You need to make it as easy for them to understand as possible, and they may not be directly in your research area either. Usually they will be pretty close, but you can't guarantee it. So clarity is really important. So in that first paragraph of any research application, where at all possible, you want to state really clearly what you want to achieve, why it's important, and ideally why it should be done now, why it's timely, and why you were the right team or the right people, or the right person rather, to do this particular work. And like I said, get that right up in the first paragraph. It's not always possible if you're on a portal and you're very restricted in how you fill out the application, but in a normal application you would put that right at the top, and then you'd often follow on with the track record then. So I put a sort of spurious example in there that you start off with what your project's going to consider this question, and you would put that in bold. You say why it's important, why in this case it's timely, is because a new method has been developed that will allow this to happen, and then you just state very briefly that your project team is entirely relevant to this project, and then all of those will be fleshed out later. But you need to give your reader that context before they get into the detail, the nitty-gritty of your project description. So the first thing is, who is going to be reading your application? So the first person that's going to see your application, as Ray has said, is the desk officer. The desk officer is going to check that the formatting is right, that you've submitted all the paperwork you want to submit, that's needed rather, and is also going to look at the keywords probably and decide who's going to review, which reviewers they're going to send it on to. The next person who's likely to look at your application then is probably an academic reviewer. So this is one of your peers who is likely to be in your research area, and he's going to be looking to see that the background is complete, that you are genuinely addressing something new, and is going to look at your methodology and make sure that it's appropriate. The person who's going to read your application then may be a lay reviewer. So it may be a reviewer that's going to write some comments, or it might be a lay reviewer on a panel, but this is going to be somebody, a stakeholder person. So for health, it could be health applications, it could be somebody in a patient group, it could be a charity or a business that's relevant to your area. So those people are not going to be reading the methodology so much, but they are going to be very interested in the importance. They're going to be interested in methodology in as much as it might include individuals like patients, if you're doing work in health, that sort of thing. But obviously there's going to need to be some explanation for them that is not highly technical and scientific. And then the final group of people that are likely to read your application will be the actual panel members. You can find out things like panel members, who funders use as their reviewers. You can find the scoring sheets that they send out to reviewers. And you can also find out what grants have been funded in the past. All of this can be found to different degrees on funders' websites. So it's always worth doing your research. Have a look, see what you can find out. Particularly charities and things like that, it can be quite surprising who they've got in their review panel. And you want to just have a look at them and make sure that you're addressing the right people. It's important to remember that you've got to be clear, you've got to use consistent language, you've got to use consistent formatting, you need to convince them that the project is important, so be as clear as possible, but you also need to make it look well structured and well thought out. So good structure of your application and consistent language is very important. So remember that the person, I think Ray has mentioned, the panel members may be in a hurry, you need to make it easy for people to scan read. And your job at the point of the application is to convince all your readers that your project is important and you're the right person and the right team. It's not to convince them that you have an interesting flowery writing style or can write very technical English. Your job is to be as clear as possible at this point and have the right level of detail for the readers. So you'll need to know who your readers are. So can you move on one slide, please, Martin?
Before you do that, can I add to that?
Yeah.
So what's worked before is an important part of certainly what I would recommend you look at as well. Certainly if you go for a fellowship, for instance, have a look at what success actually looks like and what stage successful fellowship candidates actually were, what kind of number of publications they had at that point, because all of that is available most of the time on the internet somewhere. So I tend to actually have a look at Google Scholar and actually see what people actually have published at different stages. And you can nicely work your way back as well, because you can actually see what the publication profile was of somebody when they did the application in 2020 or 2019. And then you can actually have a good understanding of what a panel is looking for.
And can I just say one thing also about this? So in terms of what Joanne was saying about, finding out as much as possible about who the scorers will be, who will be reading your review. It's not the exact person, it's the type of people. So you may not know who exactly will be on that particular panel, and that to an extent is irrelevant, but you want to know what kind of readers, what kind of assessors that particular body has, how specialist they will be or not. And some bodies, for instance, use more generic readers than others. So you need to be aware of that kind of thing. I don't think that you should pay too much attention to, oh, I'm writing for Loredana Polezzi or for Rhea or for Joanne. That is beyond the point. So
yeah, that's too far.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I should have made that clearer. Yes, don't try and write for individuals, because you can't guarantee they're going to be on the panel that day. You look at who they use, what type of person. Are they lay people? Are they business people? Are they patient groups? Or are they academics that are very much in your area? It's really important to know the type of reviewer. Thanks, Loredana. I'll just go through this quickly. It's very important to know what's required before you start writing. You don't want to suddenly find out 20 minutes before the deadline that you needed 3 CVs and a publication list for each applicant on your project. And this does happen, believe me. I've had to rush to get CVs together for people right up to deadlines. Look at the beginning and make sure you know exactly what's required. If it's a document that you need to submit, make sure you understand what sections are required. If it's a portal, have a look at all the boxes. Quite often, even if you can't cycle through the portal without filling it in, you can get hold of a Word document. Sometimes they'll send it to you if you email them, or sometimes it's actually available on the web page. So just try and find out what's required before you even put pen to paper. And the other thing that drives reviewers up the wall quite often is where people don't put the things that are requested in the right section. So if you have a box that says background, only put background information in there, the background to the research. Don't start putting some track record in there as well, because you ran out of space in the track record section. You won't get any extra points usually for doing that. Just fill in the application as has been requested. If the word count or the character count is very restricted, or the number of pages you're allowed to submit is very restricted, that indicates to you what level of detail the funder wants. It doesn't mean try and squeeze in all of your information that you were trying to fit into 10 pages into 3 by using an awful lot of acronyms and a tiny font size. That indicates the level of detail they wanted. If they only want 3 pages, give them 3 pages. Don't try and squeeze 10 pages into 3. Again, it's annoying for reviewers and it won't help you. You're trying to make your proposal structure as clear as possible. You want to make it easy for your reader to navigate, especially if they're skimming through. So they may have read it a few weeks ago when they're on the train on the way to the panel meeting, the panel member. They just want to skim through it. You need to use headings, bold, lists, diagrams appropriately. Don't make every 3rd sentence bold. That's not going to help your reader. So don't make it cluttered, make it clear, but try and keep a very consistent structure. So an example that works quite well in science applications is you have a research question that splits into a number of aims. So you'd have aim 2 is to do X, Y, and Z. That would then be fulfilled by work package 2. Work package 2 might have a series of objectives, things that you want to achieve, and then you might have a series of outputs that are all still labelled with 2, so 2.2 and 2.2a and b. It's just a really nice way to help your reviewer navigate your application, especially when it's complicated. If it is very complicated, diagrams to explain the overall structure of your project are really helpful as well if you've got lots of outputs leading into other work packages. And like I said, use consistent vocabulary. This is particularly important when you've got non-specialists who are reviewing it. If you've got a technical term, explain it once and then consistently use that technical term in the same way. Don't start referring to something in another way halfway through the application, or refer to the same thing with 3 different words. Just use the same terminology all the way through. It makes a big difference to people who are not specialists in your area. And obviously explain your technical words where you need to, and always put your acronyms out full. Even if you think they're obvious, they may not be. And I come across this all the time as a non-biologist in the biology department. People who think that the acronym for some piece of kit is universally known, and it just isn't. So I've whizzed through that a bit. Are there any questions on that? I can see there's some activity in the chat. Yeah, I would agree with Loredana's answer that, yeah, you look at how many words you can put, and that will indicate how full an answer they want. Keywords wouldn't normally be enough in a section called background.
Most of the time you get 500 words, 1,000 words, 3,000 words, or something like that. And there's a clear indication. Stick to those words, because somebody will count them, or the portal will actually count them for you. The best portals actually give an indication how many words you've got left to play with. And the same actually goes for reviewers and panel members as well. Reviewers will have a limited set of words to actually respond to your proposal.
Absolutely. And if you are struggling with rewriting something to fit in half the number of characters or whatever it is you're allowed, get someone to help you. It's something that I've done frequently with academics is they've given me some text and they say, can you cut this down by 2/3 or 1/3 or something? And it's just helpful to have a fresh pair of eyes on something. Definitely. But it can be a struggle. But these are the things that you need to know in advance so that you can give enough time to making sure that you've got all the information you need.
A little bit of background on me and the example, the main examples on which I will be basing my observations. So, as I said in my very brief introduction at the beginning of this section, I have been part of a few large grants, and in recent years, in particular 2 funded by UKRI, one under the Translating Cultures theme, which was a large grant for just shy of £2 million. And then a follow-on from that, which was another, well, altogether, I think almost £500,000, which was a GCRF, Global Challenges Research Fund. So both of those grants were international, and both of those started their life from other smaller grants, either internal to universities or external ones, which were dedicated to building networks. So you can have precisely network grants with UKRI, for instance, you have network grants international or otherwise. So in my case, those networking grants and also grants internal to our own institutions. At the time I was at Warwick University when these sort of ideas started to develop, were vital to eventually building up to the large grants. And so the comments that I'll make are based mostly on those. And although those particular individual projects, as in the funded phases of these projects, have now expired, the projects are complete. However, we're still working with those networks of people in different permutations, with people joining the core group or others not being necessarily part of every single activity that we do. But we're constantly thinking about other things that we want to do in order to achieve our overall bigger objectives. So I think one of the points that I would like to make is that even with the largest of grants, if you're building a network of people nationally, internationally, those cooperations often begin way before and continue way after the actual life of a specific grant. And so it's a balance. You're trying to find the right people for the grant that you want to apply for and for the project that you want to do. But you also, as a group of people who are working together towards particular goals in your research, whatever your field, in the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, you are also constantly looking for the right sources of grants for what it is that you want to do. So it's a very dynamic process, and it's an ongoing process. And can we go to the slide that I have on with the tabs with the various words? Yeah. So tips basically on network building. Whatever version of this slide I use, I always have somewhere the idea of, yeah, serendipity, but also how to find it. So there is, we were talking about it this last week, there is an element of being in the right place at the right time, but that is not happening by chance. By the way, the logo you have on the top right there, Transnationalizing Modern Languages, that is the large grant that I was talking about, which was the translating themes, one of the translating themes beacon projects. So the first thing that I would say is that, I know it sounds obvious, but in order to be able to build a network, you need to network. So if you're not out there, that doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean networking, and this is the point that Emily, I know, wanted to make. It doesn't mean something cynical or sleek, you know, it's not whining and dining people or anything like that. It's about knowing what the key events are, for instance, in terms of conferences or symposia and so on. It's about making your work visible in the right outlets. So it's about the fact that you need to be in these places in order to encounter these opportunities. If nobody knows about you, if nobody knows about your work, it becomes difficult then to build your own network, but also to be one of the people, one of the names that come up when people think, okay, I need, you know, I want to build my own network. Oh, I met someone who was working on this and was really, really interesting and was giving an interesting paper. So there has to be some visibility. And then think beyond the obvious. When you are at these conferences, if you are at this symposia, it doesn't necessarily mean that you always have to make a beeline for, I don't know, the most famous expert in the field, person who seems to be the leading expert and so on. Very often what you're doing is building networks that are at your level of career. You're building that group and you're building honestly for the long term. So the third point is prepare to commit, because it takes time. So as I said, the group of people with whom I've been working mostly on the large grants, we started working together in the early 2000s. We've now been working together in one way or another at a distance, more closely in larger groups and smaller groups, but for a couple of decades. And so we went through our careers in parallel and at least partly together. We started this early career, we started putting new ideas forward, trying to change something in our field. And with now pretty much all at chair level, but that was part of that process. So think about different moments and prepare to commit. And then a question that is, Emily was saying she doesn't like the word networking. I don't particularly like the word leadership. So the teams that I've worked in, yes, there has to be someone who is down as the PI, for instance. And yes, they have a responsibility to make sure that that certain milestones are met, that reporting is done, that financial accounts are being looked after, and so on. But that is, again, these are labels I don't particularly like, and that sort of trendy or fashionable for a while, and then they go out of date. But it's leadership as service, fine. But within the team, the most important thing is that you share a goal and you have complementary skills. And that applies also to the writing of applications, even before you start the actual work. In our group, for instance, we know very well, some are more really the idea people. Some are the fine tuners of script and are the ones who can be very incisive, really find that paragraph that will hit at the beginning of an application, will tell people all these things that Joanne was talking about that need to be there from the start to grab people's attention. Others are really, really good at being critical, but they're so much better at destroying than they are at building. So here you have to use them in a sense as in a contained way. Otherwise, they might destroy the whole application 100 times but not rebuild it. So the important thing is to know what your skills are and to play on those. And having people with complementary skills is really important. Equality and diversity, as I said, well, hopefully it's something that you should care about, because it is something that we should all care about. but it's certainly also something that funding bodies are increasingly caring about. And so as you're building your team, you're building your network, think about that as well. And, you know, it is ethnicity, gender, all backgrounds, all kinds of other things that if your group is so completely the same, well, go back to the previous tab. Where are the complementary skills? Where is the innovation? Where is the diverse way of thinking going to come from? So it's also a plus for you. It's not some kind of, you know, ticking a box. It's important to have that diversity of voices in order to have projects that then incorporate these perspectives. And that includes issues of languages and culture. And I mean that not just for the humanities and the social sciences, but also for the sciences. If you are thinking about projects that then will have an impact on society, that will also communicate the finding of your research effectively and have an important consequences at a social level in the wider community, then you always need to think about communication. And that's where cultures, so sort of disciplinary cultures, working transdisciplinarily from the beginning, but cultures also in terms of the places in the world, the places in society where the finding of your research will be important, and what languages, again, specialists, non-specialists, but also English or other languages, that's something to think about. Within your network, effectively, there are relationships of trust. There will always be a moment when someone lets someone else down, when someone is too busy to do something, but there has to be an underlying relationship of trust where you know that people are committed, that even if they make a mistake, it's, you know, in the best, with the best of intentions. And when you will also be able to step in for somebody else if at a certain point life takes over, because life does tend to take over at certain moments. So those networks become also, and this is something that I think maybe happens in all walks of life, but in academia it happens very often. Those networks become also very much part of your friendship networks, which is a plus and a minus. You know, friendships have their own dynamics, and work and friendships sometimes get mixed up. But whenever I am asked, and as I said, as a group, with or without large grants and small grants, we've worked together now for almost 2 decades. Whenever I'm asked what is the greatest achievement we have managed, I always say that the greatest result of all our work is that we're still all talking to each other, and we are actually all still friends. And that is not an obvious thing. You do need to find people that you are happy to work with. And as with all groups, there will be occasionally clashes of personality. There will be, as I said, moments when you're annoyed with someone, but there has to be that underlying sense of a shared goal that will keep you together. Otherwise, it's going to be a very tough ride working as intensively as projects require you to work. I think I'll stop there and have a look at the chat and see if there are questions or comments that need answering. And I don't know if Ray or Joanne or anybody else wants to make any comments on what I just said.
I think there's actually a question in the chat from Anastasia about sort of who actually writes or delegation of grant writing and things like that. And if the PI is always the idea maker. Not always.
No.
But the PI can actually be clearly at the forefront. I've actually PI'd things where I've actually done very little writing and being PI for different reasons. But also I've actually, as a PI, I've actually written most of the proposal, and certainly with external collaborators in industry or in the healthcare sector, they will do very little writing. They will actually contribute to the overall process and generating ideas, but they might be slightly adverse to doing the paperwork. And we've got good support for paperwork and things like that. So it's a discussion that we tend to have early on in the process. It's probably one of the first things you actually discuss, who will actually do what at different stages, and be very clear about it as well. Yeah. Communication is key aspect here. And what you don't want to do is actually start working with a set of people, upset them at some point, and then actually fall apart again before you submit your grant proposal. That is a very difficult process. So I fully agree with Loredana that actually making sure that you actually trust each other and that you spend time together, setting the scene at the beginning and making sure that it's actually long-lived. I put in the chat as well, so most of, or a large part of my funding is actually based on 2 collaborations. One that actually goes back to one of my first PhD students, and one that goes back to when I actually arrived in Wales and became part of a larger network.
And I would also say, you know, different grants are written in different grant application are written in different ways. So sometimes it pays to have an intensive session. So I've even in the past, I've even done things like literally retreats, you know, grant writing retreats. You're somewhere for 2 days in the same space, literally staying, you know, in the same house and writing intensively together. In other cases, or even for the same grant but in different phases, you sort of ping-ponging a file. You know, someone is writing and then sending it to someone else, and it's like a round robin, and someone else will chip in a certain section or add a certain part, and it keeps going round. So it's done in different ways. And again, who writes more? It depends also on the size of the grant and the size of the group. Obviously, you know, some grants are much more individual and you're doing the lion's share of the work. When it is collaborative, it should be collaborative. It's also, if you're building a team, it doesn't really, it's not a good sign if it's meant to be a team, but someone is doing all the work. And it's not good for the person who's doing all the work, but it's also not good for the people who are not doing the work and who are not feeling part of the project and not being sort of called upon for their skills and so on. So I think it's important to make sure that you know, again, they're buzzwords, but co-researching, co-designing, that this is not just something that you state that you do in your application and that you then try to do in the actual project. If it's a co-research, co-design project, then you should be co-writing it as well. There has to be an element of that. It doesn't suddenly become shared afterwards. And I think that's even more important when you're working with international teams, when you're working with teams in south of the world, for instance. It's easy to slip into that position where it's like, oh yeah, but we'll be applying in the UK. And so we really are the ones with the expertise. We know who the funding body is. Just give me a couple of names and then we'll do the rest. That's not necessarily the best basis for collaboration, both in terms of ethics and diversity, but also in terms of the actual dynamics of that group as you go forward.
Within Aberystwyth University, we've actually got small pots of funding available for students and ECRs to actually set up small conferences and things like that. And most of the time they will actually do that within a peer group. And so it's actually extending that peer group through that network and through that activity, and that seems to work really well for them. So have a look in your local university as well, what's available. There are small pots of funding. I think they can bid for 500 or 750, and that will actually give them a day conference effectively. They can invite an eminent speaker and they can do some other things. They can share lunch if that's on site. Clearly difficult at this point, but
yeah, there's
and also so, no, I was saying also, you know, helping out. So if your institute, if the institution you're attached to, you're associated with, is organizing an event, helping out with those makes you sort of, puts you in a position where you're constantly talking to people and people will remember you, and so it's another way of networking, collaborating with others.
And I think that there's been sort of comments around supervisors and how you actually can link into their network as well, and clearly do that down again then as well. So your supervisor links you up to the supervisor or somebody else, and then make sure you actually take that, the supervisees of that supervisor into account as well, because they tend to be at your same level. And I indicated earlier on as well, I think the peer aspect might actually last you longer than the most important person in your field, because the most important person in your field is at a different stage. They're interested most of the time in different things, and they don't tend to be very available. While a peer group, people actually are at the same stage, they're interested in the same things, they will apply for similar bits of funding, and that can actually last you a long time.
And this is something that we've used in Aberystwyth quite a lot. It's quite a well-known system for formulating your ideas. You've got an idea and you want to know whether you've got a proposal, you want to sort of get it down into a useful structure. I need to reference the Parker Derrington blog where this comes from. It was originally presented at an ARMA conference quite a few years ago, but there's a lot more information on that link there, which you'll find really, if you think this might be a useful technique for you, do visit that blog and have a look. There's a lot of resource about it. So the idea is that if you can write 10 key sentences about your idea, you have a fully formed project to go, basically. You could write it up into a project proposal. So it's an opportunity to try out your ideas, work out what the limits of your project are, what are the edges, what are you going to do, what are you not going to do. Is it too big or too small for the funder? Once you've worked out what you actually need to achieve, is the funding opportunity you've got in mind actually not big enough for what you need to do? Do you need to reformulate it smaller? Can you do everything that's needed? Do you need to bring in collaborators? You can then use it to ask for feedback. So you sort of get 10 key sentences, which would usually fit onto 1 or 2 sides of A4. And you can use that to ask for feedback from people, to give it to people when you're asking for collaboration, sort of outline of your ideas. You can put it in the drawer and wait for the right funding call to come up, and it can then form the backbone of your proposal when you come to write it. So we're going to dive straight in and look at what the 10 key sentences are. Can I have the next slide, please? Some years ago, a colleague and I came up with a spurious example that was cross-disciplinary, and it was about chickens crossing the road, which we've used quite a lot. In the materials for this, we're going to send out the one-pager, which is the full 10 key sentences for this imaginary project. So all the examples here are based on that. So the first sentence should give the reader an idea of what your project is going to be. So the first sentence will start something like, this project it will do something. You need to give it a little bit of detail. You're normally looking for about 1 sentence. Obviously, it might be 2. We don't need to get too specific, but it's certainly not a paragraph. So in this chicken example, we're looking at chicken road crossings, basically. That's what the idea of this project is. So we're going to develop a model of chicken behaviour at road crossings, and we're going to take into account a set of environmental factors. And there's a set of examples there. It's not an exclusive list, but that's what we want to do in our project. So that's the first thing. And that will often actually form the first sentence of your application then when it's been refined. Sentence 2 is the importance of the problem. So in this case, we've got some imaginary figures that we've dreamt up about how much chickens crossing roads costs the Welsh economy every year. So it might be an economic issue, it might be a social issue, but something that you can cite that says why this problem is important. It could be anything depending on your discipline and what's important. Can I have the next slide, please? So sentence 3 are the aims of your project, just briefly. So what is it that you need to know? So in order to develop our model, we need to know, in our case, the pattern of chickens crossing roads and the deaths, the environmental conditions, how chickens themselves perceive their behaviour, and whether the resulting model can successfully predict road deaths of chickens. So that's what we need to know. And that's going to form, again, that'll form then the backbone of our aims and objectives later. Sentence 6 then is an overview. So what do we need to do? Just fleshing things out a little bit. What's that going to give us, and what's the larger context of this? So in our case, with our chickens, we're going to combine a whole set of information. We're going to do some environmental monitoring. We're going to do it over 6 months. We're going to do some interviews with chickens. I did say this was a spurious example. It was Judith who came up with the chicken vocalizations model, and we're gonna create a model, and then we're gonna evaluate our model at the end. And this is going to help us help Welsh farmers impose mitigation methods. So next slide, please. I should also state that you don't have to do these sentences in order. You might decide to do the sentence 1 first and then move on to something else, move on to a separate sentence. There's no reason why these have to be done in a specific order. So the next set of sentences then refer back to what it is that we need to know. So we're now looking at moving down into the methodology. What are we going to do to find out the things that we needed to know? So for each of the things we needed to know, and it's a lot harder on slides. I usually do it on I usually do it with a handout. I think it was sentences 3 to 5. What do we need to know? We should now have the same number of sentences here that say how we're going to find those out. So in order to get information about how many chickens die crossing roads, we're going to go to the Welsh Government's records and we're going to find the information. In order to find out the environmental conditions over 6 months, we're going to do some monitoring. And there's a little bit of detail there about that. A little bit of detail about the interviews that we're going to do. So we're sort of drilling down. It's not just that we need interviews. We're now saying we're going to do this many interviews. We're going to look at this many sites and so on. And then finally, to see if the model works, we're going to use it to predict the road deaths at a further site for which we've collected environmental data. So that's the example. And there's one more sentence, sentence 10, if we can move on again to the next slide, which is the dissemination. So this says something about what we'll do with the results at the end. So to disseminate or gain impact, we're going to, so in this case, we're going to publish the results at a conference, and we're going to give a seminar at the Royal Welsh Show. Oh, there's an extra comma there, it shouldn't be there. And we'll make our model available under a CC BY license. So that is basically how this all works. So you could, like I said, you can put this together over time. You can put it together in any order you like. You'd usually come up to about a side or maybe 2 sides of it for a push, but you want to keep it brief. There are actually people, the guys who came up with this actually run whole courses for, I think it's a day or even 2 days where you go in with your idea. So I have given you an extremely quick rundown of how it all works, but I've also, for your handout, given you the whole of the example in one go. And if you think you might find it useful, have a look at the link in the blog.
This is a very brief overview of what a panel might actually be. And so in general, panels are actually about 15 plus people that actually look at a large set of proposals. So it can be 20 plus proposals in a single day, which also indicates that people will actually not spend lots of time on a proposal, and 15-20 minutes per proposal is a normal. All panel members are expected to actually have looked at all the proposals. So there's quite a bit of overhead for a panel member. And if you think about that set of people sitting in the room, spending time on your proposal, make sure that it's actually the best you can do. Based on some of the panels that I've been on, effectively, a few panel members will actually present a proposal, and that can be a first and a second reader. And if it's actually, so for instance, on some of the medical panels I'm on, there will actually be an end user reader as well. Joe Public will actually contribute to that. And most of the time that are very knowledgeable people. They actually have been volunteers within the clinical sector, and they actually know about patient groups, etc., etc. And they can actually spot if co-creation actually happened after the proposal was written, or if it was truly co-creation. And that's an important part in that area. So readers will actually present a proposal, and it will actually look at strengths and weaknesses and reviewers' comments and the response that you, the PI, might actually have had to the reviewers' comments as well. And all of that is taken into account. On some panels, the panel members are not supposed to actually re-review the proposal. On some other smaller panels, that might actually be the case, where there's input expected from the panel members as well. Based on all the information they've got. After the presentations, there tends to be a sort of overall discussion within the panel about the proposal. And some proposals are actually taken apart at that point and looking at what the reviewers have said. And if you as a PI actually haven't responded, to the reviewers sufficiently, then that is taken into account as well. Why didn't you respond to that aspect? That seems really important to the reviewers. Why did you ignore that? Can be an important question. Clearly, if you're sitting on clinical panels, then statistical significance and number of patients that you actually hope to use is an important aspect as well. And if you ignore questions around that, then that can actually be detrimental to your proposal. Some panels actually have sort of random order, and some of them actually have the order of the reviewer scores into account as well. So you can actually see already who's at the top and the bottom of the list before any discussion happens. Everything is taken into account. We've talked early on, I talked about sort of the possibility of interviews. So for fellowships, for instance, certainly UKRI, there tends to be interviews. And in the previous session, we talked about doing mock interviews and etc., etc. That's also the case for larger projects. So I was actually part of the interviewed team for the CDT that I mentioned earlier, where we actually got 55 PhD studentships. And that was an interesting aspect because you can actually see the competition as well, because they were milling around beforehand in the same room. And so it was actually half an hour with a panel of 45 minutes. And that actually determined then where things ended up in discussion with looking at the other things later on. The proposals are all ranked at the end of the process and then discussed again. And most of the time, panels will actually discuss funding boundaries and also indicate where they think that things should not be funded. So there might be actually two boundaries that are important. The one where they actually say, well, everything above this should be funded, but also a boundary that indicates anything below this should not be funded. And they make recommendations. Most of the time, the panel actually doesn't decide the funding because the funding body does. And that is actually happening afterwards. So it will only do recommendations. That was fairly quickly. Loredana, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's a huge amount of stuff to read. So you are assigned, usually as a panelist, again, in the big panels, you're assigned some applications as the first reader, second reader, sometimes there's a reserve person as well. To give you an idea, I have been on panels where the reading matter that gets sent to you a couple of weeks before is something like 3,000 plus pages. Okay, they're applications, so they're not solid pages, but nevertheless, it's a lot of reading. So if you're not the rapporteur, you will be probably skimming over, but not reading all of the pages of every single application. So again, those more generic paragraphs that the summary, the description of the project are really vital to strike people. And it's vital that the reviews are useful. Some reviews are much more useful than others. And I have also been on panels where some reviews that became quite nastily, perhaps critical or personal in some way, can be excluded from consideration if the panelists think that they are. It's very rare, I have to say. What is less rare is that the reviewers themselves are not necessarily putting information that is important. So a recommendation also, if you end up being reviewers for research applications, in your review, try to be helpful. You know, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of that application? Be as clear as possible, and that is important. And I think that's all I want to add.
And I fully agree with that. If you get the opportunity to actually review for a panel on grant applications, do so. If you actually get the opportunity to actually be part of a panel, definitely say yes. You'll actually see, as I said, on a typical day, 20 plus proposals, and you actually see what's good and bad as well. And you actually learn a lot from that, and you'll actually become a commodity within your university at that stage, because people like Joe will actually come to you and you actually have to do talks about what this is to be on panels and etc., what is good, what is bad in a proposal as well.
So yeah, again, seconded, you learn an awful lot. And one last thing actually about interviews. What I was saying earlier about complementary skills, think about that. Often in large, so the interviews often are for large grants, for large proposals. You may have a very broad team for that, not the whole, it's not possible for the whole team to go to the interview. So again, think about who are the best ones to present orally, who are the ones who will be very effective on the day. It may not, well, the PI will have to be there, but then it may not be that the same people who are the best ones at finalizing the written version are the best ones to present it orally on the day. Play to your strengths as a team.
And adding to that again, so for the CDT, it's effectively the PI was there for the interview. We had, because our PhD studentships are all done in collaboration with end users, we had a commercial end user in the room as well with us, and I was actually representing the PGR training aspects within the proposal. So there was a mix of things. We actually had a very detailed discussion beforehand, and if I remember correctly, we did 3 mock interviews beforehand with different sets of people, and that was quite intensive as well.
The writing of a grant, especially the larger ones, that many of them goes through phases. So some of the things that we've discussed, you may be doing it more than once. And I thought, you know, the 10-question exercise, for instance, it's very useful at the beginning, but you might want to do it again further down the line to make sure that in developing your grant, you haven't lost sight of that clear vision that you had at the beginning, that is still transparent to a non-specialist reader and so on. So I really thought that exercise could be one that you do more than once.
That's a really good thought, actually, Loredana. And one of the things that I find where we've got collaborations where a relatively inexperienced person is writing or leading a grant, often for the first time, something I found is they often get pulled in different directions. So you have very strong people on the bid. They'll bring in experienced PIs in order to so that they've got their experience within the bid. But those people will often try and draw a project in their direction. And it can be very difficult for someone sometimes to actually pull it back and remember what the edges of that project was that they originally defined. And sometimes it's good that these things drift and things change, and that can be a good positive thing. But you do need to be absolutely sure that your project is still aiming to achieve what you want it to do. So yeah, absolutely, I'd say doing the exercise more than once might be really valuable.
Actually, that makes me think, I mean, the one thing that I would want to say, I sort of said it last week, but ultimately it's, you want to do that project. You know, if I think of, even now, I'm in the middle of 2 applications and we're talking about plan A and plan B. If we don't get the money, we still want to do that project. How do we do that project on a shoestring if we can't do it with the full funding? Your motivation can't just be, oh, there's a grant, let me try to get it. Your motivation has to be, I want to do this project. How do I get the resources that will allow me to make it? If you're not convinced of the importance of that project, you're not going to convince anybody else. And if you're that convinced, you really want to do it,